The thunder of those new Han cannons is still ringing in my ears. That detailed test-firing sequence was absolutely electrifying, from the initial hopeful shots to the sheer destructive power of canister and the incredible range achieved. It feels like the entire strategic landscape just tilted. While the MC was methodically perfecting this game-changing weaponry, the intelligence reports paint a desperate picture for Commander Shin, cornered and now seeking an alliance with Moden. Yuya, meanwhile, is a force of quiet strength, building a new Han foothold far away. The contrast is stark. My heart pounded seeing those cannons finally roar to life. It's not just metal and gunpowder. It's the sound of an era shifting. With the Shin-Moden alliance looming and these devastating cannons now proven, how can the old powers possibly stand against this tide? The inevitable confrontation just got a whole lot more explosive. The cannons roared, parameters finalized. With a decisive wave of your hand, mass production. Start with 200 standard 12-pounders. Whether for land or sea, just this one model. Simple, brutally effective. Efficiency is paramount. You figured you'd first allocate 120 cannons. Even if it meant selling the farm, you had to get a gunboat. The large lake near Kaiyuan Prefecture, the Tang Tribes estuary, and even distant Bamboo Island. Wherever a ship could sail, the gunboat could go to negotiate. A mobile steel fortress. The very thought was exhilarating. Of the remaining 80, headquarters would keep 20 for base defense. The other 60 would all be transported to Kaiyuan Prefecture on the grasslands. Some would be mounted on the city walls as fixed emplacements, their motto, "Any invader dies." The rest would be fitted onto gun carriages for mobile field operations. Hit and run, a real thrill. The gun carriages were ready-made, only the mounts for fixed emplacements were missing. These mounts, used on both city walls and ships, couldn't move around like carriages, but their recoil absorption and return-to-battery systems had to be absolutely top-notch. Field artillery carriages, on the other hand, prioritized load capacity and speed. Different needs. Fixed emplacements typically required steel guide rails, restricting the gun mount to sliding back and forth on the tracks. The front of the gun pit also needed rope and pulley systems, enabling gunners to handle the cannons proficiently, even in cramped spaces. After several days of toiling away, the rail-mounted gun platforms were finally completed. Carrying a few sample cannons and mounts, you rushed post-haste to the shipyard in Luoyang Prefecture. There, an 80-meter-long vessel had just had its keel laid and wasn't fully constructed, perfect for converting into a sailing gunship. Resource utilization. The hull itself would require minimal changes. The main work was refitting the interior. A gunship, after all, needed a completely clear deck. The powder magazine and shell room had to be individually partitioned, and the crew's quarters made more livable. Details, as they say, determine success. A vessel this size would carry a considerable crew. With 120 cannons, each requiring a team of 5, that meant 600 gunners alone. Add sailors and other personnel, and you'd likely need 800 men just to operate it. With over 800 men eating, drinking, and attending to nature's calls on board, the ship's interior would need a major overhaul, or it would likely reek to high heaven. Another huge challenge was the command communication system. If the captain yelled himself hoarse from above, but the gunners on the lower decks couldn't hear, the gunship's superior firepower would be useless. Modifying compartments and designing the layout was all laborious, detailed work. To ensure the Han tribe's first gunship, the Navy's precious firstborn, came into being smoothly, you simply packed your bedroll, set up camp in Luoyang Prefecture, and personally oversaw the shipbuilding progress every day. While you were busy constructing this mobile Great Wall at sea, elsewhere, the 6 support sailboats for Yuya had unhurriedly reached the Sancha River mouth, upstream on the Ruyang River, successfully rendezvousing with Yuya's own 2-masted vessel, Yuya's crew, who hadn't been home in more than 6 months, were so thrilled they nearly stomped through the deck. The Remnant Tribe leaders and their men, who had tagged along for the spectacle, were even more astounded. their eyes wide as dinner plates, jaws practically dropping into the river. They'd initially believed it was astounding enough that the Remnant tribe could construct aquatic behemoths like two-masted sailboats. After all, these vessels were fast, capacious, and, as they'd personally experienced, comfortable. But who would have guessed? The Han tribe, as if churning them out like dumplings, had now arrived with 5 more identical ships, plus an even larger 3-masted vessel leading the way, easily double the size of the one they were on. Witnessing the Han tribe's formidable strength, their confidence in eventually defeating the cannibalistic pale fiends, rescuing their kin, and moving to the Han tribe territories for a better life instantly surged. After representatives from both sides exchanged effusive pleasantries, they set sail once more, making for the river valley encampment. With the favorable winter tailwinds, the 7 large ships, sails filled taut, journeyed for half a month, huffing and puffing their way before finally arriving. In the camp, Yuya and several thousand Remnant Tribes people had been waiting. With such anticipation, their necks were practically stretched out like cranes. Had they been half a month later, the river surface would have frozen into an ice rink, and the fleet wouldn't have been able to return. Without seeds and with the spring planting season missed, the sustenance of several thousand people would have been truly at risk. Thankfully, they had made it just in the nick of time. At the simple River Valley wharf, a dense mass of several thousand people surged forward to greet them, giving even the newcomers from the Han tribe, self-proclaimed country bumpkins, quite a start. Good heavens, this Yuya fellow, leagues and leagues from home, had actually managed to round up so many wild folk. For this achievement, he was sure to receive great commendation upon his return. Many of the newcomers were kicking themselves in regret. We really missed out. If only we'd known there were so many chances to earn merit by venturing out like this. No, they resolved. We absolutely must complete the chief's assignments perfectly this time, and try to earn ourselves the title of expedition captain to flaunt sooner rather than later. A considerable number of people had arrived on this trip. It was, after all, a brand new temporary settlement with a large population and a multitude of diverse tasks. A large group of artisans from various trades had come, bringing with them many novel gadgets, some of which even Yuya hadn't encountered before. Take, for instance, the carbide lamps being unloaded from the ships when Yuya had last left. The Han tribe, such things weren't even a whisper of an idea. Now they were being mass-produced. The world was changing so rapidly, his mind struggled to keep pace. Ah, Administrator Yu, congratulations, congratulations, exclaimed the newly arrived official representative, stepping off the boat and clasping his hands in a salute to Yuya, his face beaming. You have indeed performed outstanding service for our great Han tribe. Not at all, not at all, Yuya replied, ever the smooth operator, his words deflecting the praise flawlessly. This is the result of everyone's efforts. What could I accomplish? Alone? I'll be relying heavily on all of your support going forward. You manage the camp well, and I can go out more to cajole. No, I mean recruit more people to join us. As for credit, if we all prosper and expand, the cake gets bigger, and everyone naturally gets a larger slice. Administrator Yu, you're too kind, the new official chuckled. This is simply our duty. We wouldn't dream of shirking it. Besides, we mustn't disappoint the chief's earnest hopes, must we? We're all just doing our part to build up the tribe, so there's no need for such formalities. Yuya mentally rolled his eyes. Well, well, you old fox, he thought. Here I am, good enough to offer you a share of the credit, and you try to pull rank on me using the chief? Outwardly, of course, his demeanor remained as pleasant as a spring breeze. After a few more polite exchanges, he began to direct the camp's inhabitants to unload the supplies. Seeds and tools were piled high as hillocks, alongside a large stock of iron ingots, enough for the artisans to hammer and clang away all winter, producing a substantial number of farm implements before spring arrived. Other daily necessities were steadily unloaded. Nearly 1,000 iron woks gleamed in an open area, their shine almost blinding. There were also various tools and bolts of cloth. The sheer generosity of the Han tribe left the Remnant Tribes people in the camp utterly tongue-tied. They heard this was just surplus inventory from the Han tribe's warehouses. If they considered what the Han people used themselves, how many more wonderful things must they have? It beggared belief. The iron wax and cloth could be claimed free of charge, but it wasn't a free-for-all. Now that the Han tribe had taken full control of the camp, things would be done by their rules. The top priority, a census and an inventory of supplies, all to be clearly and precisely documented. This would help in organizing production and assigning tasks when spring arrived. Yuya arranged lodgings for the arrivals from the Han homelands. The dwellings were basic, but they provided shelter from the elements, and each had a kang, heated brick bed, inside, ensuring no one would freeze. If one wanted to earn merit, how could one avoid a little hardship? As the saying goes, don't mend porcelain without a diamond drill. Don't take on what you can't handle. The officials also received a rudimentary administrative office. In truth, a small courtyard enclosed by earthen walls, containing a few relatively tall adobe buildings. A flagpole was erected in the center, from which the Han tribe's grand banner snapped smartly in the wind, lending an air of considerable prestige. The new Han tribesmen were deft and efficient. They'd even brought their own desks from their homeland. All necessary office supplies were present, including, of course, the essential 4 treasures of the study: brush, ink, paper, and inkstone. The officials and clerks quickly settled into their roles, producing stacks of blank forms and bamboo slips. With bustling energy, they commenced the task of compiling household registers, the bian system. This was their inaugural major undertaking, and it absolutely had to succeed. Yuya called a special meeting with the leaders of the various Remnant Tribes. He painstakingly broke down the concept of household registration for them, explaining in the simplest terms what it meant and its advantages, such as enabling a clear grasp of each family's circumstances to facilitate the equitable distribution of labor and resources. The leaders listened, nodding in agreement, and vowed to implement it thoroughly as soon as they returned to their people. The tangled mess of marital and kinship lines within each tribe, previously as chaotic as a stirred pot of kanji, also needed to be thoroughly straightened out. This was a task that would require the personal attention of the tribal leaders themselves. It took a full day, but the Remnant tribe leaders eventually managed to clarify the family structures within their respective groups. Only then could the process of household registration truly and formally commence. Although everyone was required to adopt a proper surname and given name, this was a daunting task for these folk, who were used to simple, everyday nicknames like Dog Egg or Second Lass. However, the prospect of receiving valuable goods like iron wax and cloth after registering spurred them on. Forgetting their initial perplexity, they all set their minds to it, racking their brains to concoct suitable names for themselves and their kin. The newly arrived officials, for their part, were quite pleased. Though basic, the camp was surprisingly well organized, with houses arranged in neat rows, which significantly simplified their administrative tasks. In the bitter cold, they couldn't very well have everyone line up outside and freeze. So clerks were sent to summon people row by row, according to the housing layout, to come and complete their registration in batches. Upon notification, the Remnant Tribes people came with their families in tow to register. After providing their family details on the forms, each household received a family register, a bamboo slip inscribed on the spot by a clerk. Remarkably, these were created by branding characters onto the bamboo with a red-hot iron, making them unalterable. Finally, each was stamped with another red-hot iron seal, the official government household registration brand. Truly authoritative. The clerks also stressed that these family registers must be carefully preserved, as all future distributions of supplies, work assignments, and wage payments would depend on them. Eager to maximize their share of goods, the Remnant tribe leaders were certainly not foolish enough to underreport their numbers. Having received their family registers, the people delightedly collected their iron walks, cloth, tools, and other provisions. They also learned new cooking methods from the Han tribe artisans in charge of distribution. Before long, a luxurious culinary style, stew anything in an iron wok on an earthen stove with cornbread stuck to the wok's edge, swept the camp. Fish and meat would bubble away, sending fragrant aromas wafting for nearly a mile around. Unfortunately, fresh vegetables were scarce. Back in the main Han tribe territory, every household would have a cellar full of radishes and round cabbages, stored for winter. As for that wondrous vegetable, Napa cabbage, the Han tribe had yet to discover it. A real shame. Still, just being able to eat meals like these filled the Remnant Tribes people with such contentment that they would smile even in their dreams. The newly arrived bolts of cloth were also distributed on a per-person basis. It wasn't a large amount, generally just enough for a single set of undergarments, meaning they still had to wear animal hides for outer clothing. This situation wasn't much different even back in the main Han tribe settlements. Fortunately, the Han had bred many sheep over the years, so by winter, almost everyone possessed a sheepskin jacket. It was, after all, the most common and cost-effective type of warm hide. Other furs were either scarce or prohibitively expensive. Earlier that year, the Han tribe had trialed cotton cultivation and, remarkably, succeeded. They had immediately planted all the seeds from that initial crop. Working until the onset of winter, they managed a single harvest. The yield wasn't substantial, and all of it had been claimed by the nimble-fingered Xiao Dai for weaving. However, all the seeds from this new generation were carefully preserved. Come next spring, the Han tribe could roll out cotton cultivation, cross all its lands. After another 2 harvests the following year, they would have a good stockpile. Then by winter, the people could finally wear warm, padded cotton clothing and sleep under soft cotton quilts. There was no shortage of fibers for weaving cloth, but materials suitable for warm padding were scarce. Lacking cotton, their only alternative was wool. But to outfit everyone in woolen jackets and provide woolen quilts for all, the sheer number of sheep required was a daunting prospect. As for shoes, the Han tribe didn't issue them. Those, the tribesfolk generally crafted themselves in the spirit of self-reliance. While these remnant people lacked old clothes to make stitched sole shoes, straw sandals would serve as a makeshift solution for a time. And one shouldn't underestimate straw sandals. Skillful weavers could fashion them into windproof, high boots perfectly wearable in winter, clad in new undergarments, their feet in new straw sandals, with firewood to burn and grain in their cooking. Pots, the Remnant Tribes people found their lives filled with new hope. This, in turn, sparked a greater desire to learn. Since winter was a relatively idle time anyway, some began to purposefully observe the newly arrived Han artisans as they fashioned various implements. Wooden buckets, wheelbarrows, iron cleavers, an array of farm tools. These were marvels of craftsmanship the Remnant Tribes people had never witnessed. As they watched plain lumps of wood and iron transform into useful objects in the artisan's skillful hands, many were instantly captivated, clamoring to enlist as apprentices and learn these trades. Yuya took note of their enthusiasm and made arrangements accordingly. This camp was, after all, a front-line base for the offensive against the cannibals, so security was the top priority. Adult men needed to remain combat-ready and couldn't be casually diverted. "Want to learn a trade? Fine," he declared. "Let the older children and adolescents start. As for the adults," Yuya thumped his chest reassuringly, "when we eventually return to the Han territories, there will be far more advanced skills available for you to master. You'll be able to learn anything you desire. The options will be overwhelmingly plentiful." Clang, clang. In the camp, dozens of Han tribe artisans, their sweat falling like rain, toiled away forging iron in makeshift workshops. They were encircled by a ring of aspiring apprentices, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Though for the moment their duties were limited to manual labor, like stoking the fires with charcoal and pumping the bellows. though they all looked as if they'd been dragged from a river. Drenched as they were so hot they practically steamed. Blacksmithing might sound like a lofty profession, but in essence it was much like sculpting clay. Both involved shaping materials, one by hand, the other with a hammer. A straightforward, if somewhat unrefined, process. The young apprentices gazed at the steel ingots brought off the ships. In the master smith's hands, these ingots transformed as if by magic, now a cleaver, now a hoe. The boys' eyes shone like stars, and they were so consumed with admiration and envy they nearly drooled. Cleavers, farm implements, and general tools. These three were the items most in demand at the camp. Thankfully, once the workshops began operations, this pressing shortage was considerably eased. The men of the camp's hunting party, each armed with a newly forged long-handled axe and a billhook knife, looked formidable. Before the heavens started, dusting them with snowflakes, they needed to hurry and chop more firewood. Their existing reserves were barely adequate. But now, with the sudden influx of so many people, and with blacksmiths and carpenters also needing wood and charcoal for their work, everyone had to grit their teeth and make another trip into the mountains to play lumberjack. The remaining older children and any idle laborers in the camp, as long as they weren't involved in hunting, logging, or patrolling, were also organized to learn technical skills. After all, an extra skill meant an extra path in life. Farm tools were being produced at top speed, but having the tools without anyone knowing how to use them was pointless. They'd be tilling the land come spring, and while the tools would surely be ready, the people who would wield them also needed to be trained and prepared in advance. Officials sent by the Han Tribes' Ministry of Agriculture taught them patiently, and the common folk, knowing these skills were their bread and butter, learned with remarkable diligence. They had, after all, personally tasted how sweet the corn they grew themselves could be. This sense of security, knowing they could fill their bellies as long as they were willing to work hard, was something they hadn't dared to dream of before. Besides, though farming was tiring, it was safe, far less risky than their previous expeditions to hunt or gather wild fruit. However, conditions were limited. For now, plowing relied solely on human strength, as livestock was pitifully scarce. The only dozen or so wild donkeys they had were already overworked, moonlighting as transport animals, and were practically collapsing from exhaustion. The leading official from the Ministry of Agriculture in charge of water conservancy wasn't idle either. He was out with his team conducting on-site surveys. They had to carefully plan the extent of land reclamation based on the local topography, landforms, and water sources. This was meticulous work that allowed no carelessness. The areas along both banks of the river, close to the water, were all designated as paddy fields for easy irrigation. As for corn, that hardy plant thrived in drought and cold, making it better suited for the hillsides. The only hitch was irrigation. They'd likely need to build a few reservoirs on the slopes, and then use water wheels to laboriously lift water up from below. While agricultural planning and technical training were in full swing, the women of the camp weren't idle either. They were organized to learn needlework, taught to cut and sew Han tribe-style clothing, and, incidentally, to familiarize themselves with Han fashion trends. The textile industry couldn't be neglected. Not many looms had been brought this time, but there were plenty of spinning wheels, along with some older, decommissioned looms. While no one expected the camp's own cloth production to meet everyone's clothing needs, they at least had to manage, making their own grain sacks. The Han tribe couldn't possibly provide everything. In terms of textile raw materials, the Han tribe generously supplied various hemp and cotton seeds, letting them figure out what to plant and grow as they wished. Large quantity of vegetable seeds was also provided. In the Han tribe, vegetable gardening was typically women's work in their supplementary plots, so the women needed to learn vegetable cultivation techniques thoroughly as well. Everyone's enthusiasm was at an unprecedented high. This life, where they could reliably obtain food without constant roaming, was practically paradise. Even some of the nearly adult young women in the camp, seeing the men from the Han tribe's core territory, couldn't help but feel their hearts flutter. If they could marry into the Han tribe, that life, tisk tisk, it was beautiful just to imagine. Alas, a pity, a great pity. The Han men who had come this time were mostly already married with families. After all, underage children wouldn't be assigned jobs, let alone sent to this front line. Meanwhile, at the Han tribe's Luoyang Prefecture shipyard, you remained steadfastly on the shipbuilding front line, acting as chief overseer. An 80-meter-long ship. This was the Han tribe's first attempt at such a vessel. Its complexity was no less than constructing a university. After all, the ship itself was larger than any Han tribe school building, a veritable aquatic behemoth. It boasted a full 8 decks of compartments, which on land would undoubtedly constitute a tall building. 2 decks lay below the waterline, primarily for storing supplies. Gunpowder, fresh water, food, and cannonballs were mostly crammed into the lowest 3 decks. The middle 3 decks were gun decks, with 120 standard cannons, ready to fire from both port and starboard. Rows of gun ports lined the bulwarks, 60 cannons per side, 20 per deck, a truly formidable density of firepower. Staircases connecting the upper and lower decks were designed along the ship's central axis. However, between the gun emplacements on either side and the staircases, dedicated shafts and hatches were specifically created for transporting supplies. In battle, gunpowder and cannonballs could be swiftly hoisted from the lower decks via block and tackle systems, efficiency first. Further up was the open-air main deck. As for the 7th and 8th decks, these comprised the stern castle at the ship's rear. The 7th deck housed the galley and mess hall, catering to the crew's sustenance. The 8th deck contained the combat command center and meeting room, the highest point on the ship, offering an expansive view, ideal for the captain to issue orders and direct fire. The warship's propulsion system employed a 5-masted, square-rigged layout, 4 mainmasts, plus a bowsprit. Although this meant foregoing the relatively simpler fore and aft sails, square sails offered greater flexibility, could be made wider, and thus provided more power. More crucially, fore and aft rigs tended to catch crosswinds, often requiring the sails to be angled. This, in turn, made the ship prone to heeling like a roly-poly toy, all due to the leverage of the masts. But this was a gunship. If the ship listed, the cannons would likely slide to one side. How could they fight a battle then, even if, hypothetically, the cannons were secured so firmly they wouldn't slide? A listing ship would still alter the cannon's elevation and depression angles. Artillery pieces were notoriously sensitive to these angles. The slightest deviation in height could send a shot wildly off target, missing by miles. Square sails might be more cumbersome to operate, but they were less likely to cause the ship to loll about like a beached whale. This was the primary reason you had opted for the square-rigged configuration. 80 meters long, 18 meters wide, with a length-to-beam ratio of 4.4, a round bow and a flat stern, coupled with 4 billowing main sails. Her speed would undoubtedly be phenomenal. Despite a displacement exceeding 10,000 tons, her power was abundant. She'd move as if injected with stimulants. However, finding masts for such a large vessel was no easy feat. They had to be constructed using mortise and tenon joints, then reinforced with steel hoops. As for finding a single gigantic tree suitable for a mast, even if such a tree could be found, transporting and processing it would present immense hair-pulling challenges. On a sailing ship, the mast height generally couldn't be less than the ship's length. And consider, this was just the height above the main deck. This meant the mainmasts of this vessel were nearly 100 meters tall, higher than some small hills. The masts were so thick an adult couldn't encircle one with their arms, veritable sky pillars. The enormous hull also faced severe tests in terms of load-bearing and pressure resistance. To support such a massive structure and withstand water pressure, the keel and ribs used were exceptionally thick. The hull planking itself was a full 25 centimeters thick. That could hardly be called planking anymore. Beam or pillar would be more apt. Yet it was indeed used for the outer shell. Frustrating, wasn't it? Timbers of such thickness had to be thoroughly softened before they could be fitted onto the frame. Therefore, they required lengthy steaming beforehand until completely pliable. For this purpose, you even had special saunas for ship planks built, steam chests. Installing planks of this thickness was also a major headache. The craftsmen were at a loss, forcing you, the chief designer, to personally devise a solution. In the end, you decided to use winches and cables to pull them taut, followed by a hot riveting process, drilling pilot holes and then driving in the rivets. In an era without lathes to manufacture large bolts, this was the most straightforward and robust connection method. Many of the early steel frame bridges from your previous life had used similar rudimentary techniques. Applying the same technology to build a sailing ship? That was child's play. The remaining issue was waterproofing. With the Han Tribes shipbuilding industry booming, the demand for adhesives was steadily increasing. Both pigskin glue and fish bladder glue were becoming somewhat scarce. Fortunately, the Han tribe now had a new waterproofing marvel: bitumen extracted from coal tar. Hemp fibers, sawdust, gypsum powder, or crushed oyster shells were mixed with bitumen, like making mud pies, to create a black waterproof sealant. This was meticulously caulked into the seams between the planks. After several more applications of hemp rope and bitumen sealant, the surface was smoothed with bitumen and given a coat of paint for aesthetics. The waterproofing work was then complete. Bitumen had previously been a largely useless byproduct of the coking plants, something of a white elephant. Now it had finally found a purpose, a true case of turning waste into treasure. Its production volume had always been somewhat awkward. When bitumen was first produced, you had grand ambitions of building asphalt roads, but after calculating the output, well, it was best to just forget it and go to sleep. There probably wasn't even enough for roofing felt. However, for waterproofing sailing ships, the current output was just about sufficient. If you had to name, the king of waterproof adhesives, bitumen was undoubtedly the undisputed champion. Furthermore, because the Han tribe's various auxiliary industries were beginning to ramp up, you had spared no expense in outfitting the ship's two-deck stern castle. All three sides featured clear glass windows. Standing in the command room, one had an unobstructed view of the surroundings. It was wonderfully bright. Luxurious was definitely the word. However, for the sake of better command conditions, you were willing to spend this small sum. Protruding from the stern castle's command room were several metal pipes made of sheet copper. These were, in fact, the ship's primitive telephone's voice pipes. The speaking trumpets at either end were copper, but for the less critical connecting tubes in between, adhering to the principle of thrift, you had substituted bamboo, saving every little bit possible. Various components were being fabricated concurrently, all waiting for the hull to be sufficiently complete before being assembled like building blocks. Fortunately, it was winter, and many commoners were in their off-season, hibernating from farming. Plenty were willing to take on casual labor at the shipyard or various workshops for extra income, which indirectly sped up the shipbuilding process. If things continued at this pace, this super behemoth belonging to the Han tribe had a very good chance of being successfully launched before spring. Once it was out on the ocean, it would absolutely dazzle everyone, blinding them with its magnificence. As for the ship's cannons, those would actually be the last things to be installed. Only when the ship was launched and undergoing outfitting would the cannons be hoisted aboard one by one, a truly spectacular sight to imagine. The entire shipbuilding operation proceeded in an orderly fashion. After arranging everything meticulously, you could finally dust off your hands, head home, and enjoy a few days of domestic bliss. While the Han tribe's hardware was advancing by leaps and bounds, its software, naturally, couldn't afford to lag behind. First, you spent a few days at home doting on your wife and children. After moving into the new house, your family's standard of living had skyrocketed. Even though it was winter, the two little ones could bask in the sun in the upstairs glass room, enjoying a sun bath, a top-tier luxury that other children could only dream of. For the entire populace to have glass windows, the Han tribe still had a long way to go. Currently, Due to production limitations, glass was a luxury item, accessible only to a select few. Little Luo Cheng and Luo Lan, dressed in small, padded, one-piece suits hand-sewn by Xiao Dai, with adorable tiger head hats on their heads, played with building blocks in the warm, sunlit glass room upstairs. Calculated by Earth time, the two youngsters were nearly a year old. They could already toddle unsteadily while holding onto walls, precisely at that boisterous age where even dogs found them a nuisance. Fortunately, you had prepared well, providing them with plenty of toys, which just about managed to keep them content indoors and prevent them from tearing the roof down. However, though you were physically at home, you hadn't let your subordinates remain idle. During these few days back, you issued strict orders to all prefectures and counties, requiring them to retrieve records of infant mortality during production processes over the years, as well as records of illnesses and deaths among the populace. Then, they were to compile and report this data. Furthermore, since the promulgation of the merit-based enfeoffment system, which proposed granting titles and land for contributing medicinal herbs, all records of enfeoffments granted for such contributions, along with a list of medicinal herbs whose efficacy was currently confirmed by the Han tribe, also had to be compiled and submitted. By collecting this data and information, you were, of course, planning a major move to contribute to the Han tribe's medical development and significantly boost your own prestige in the process. It had been 2 years since the Han tribe established government-run schools. The first cohort of students enrolled would be graduating in another year. What would they do after graduation? Would they go straight home to farm, settle down with a wife, children, and a warm bed? Or would outstanding talents be selected to contribute their skills across various sectors of the Han tribe? Or perhaps they would pursue further studies, acquiring more advanced knowledge. These were all naturally viable options, but if they chose to continue learning, what would they study? Your idea was to implement a system of voluntary enrollment for specialized studies. You planned to establish a professional medical college dedicated to systematically training medical personnel for the Han tribe. After all, medicine was a crucial component of society, capable of tangibly increasing average life expectancy. You couldn't afford not to prioritize it. Additionally, a combined military and police academy was in the works. It would primarily teach subjects like investigation and crime solving, logical reasoning, and military command. However, this field was expected to be niche, attracting few students. Thus, for convenience, they would be taught together. Then there was an advanced Academy of Sciences. This institution would offer ordinary students a path for further, more profound study. The curriculum would cover higher-level mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and similar subjects. In modern terms, it would be akin to a polytechnic institute. However, the level of knowledge you envisioned for it was far from that of later era universities, at most falling between middle and high school levels. Its main purpose was to cultivate reserve talent for the Han tribe's various scientific research endeavors. The final academy to receive focused development could be seen as an advanced institution for humanities students. Its primary goal was to cultivate administrative officials. Besides teaching more advanced literature and mathematics to enhance students' foundational knowledge, the school would also provide systematic training in essential skills for officials, such as current affairs analysis, policy formulation, agricultural promotion, administrative management, and urban planning and construction. To put it bluntly, it was designed to specifically train and produce a larger pool of outstanding grassroots officials for the Han tribe, making tribal governance more standardized and efficient. At your command, your subordinates worked with remarkable efficiency. Data soon piled up on your desk. A quick scan revealed, not bad within your psychological expectations. Your heart could take it. The average lifespan of the common folk had noticeably increased. Most strikingly, the number of old folks over 40 was growing. Previously, reaching that age usually meant preparing for one's final affairs. Now, they were still spry and active, a medical miracle no less. Newborns were also popping up like mushrooms after rain. It was all thanks to your pro-natalist policies, such as granting tax-exempt land for having children. Han tribe families, as if injected with stimulants, were procreating with abandon. In just the past 2 years, the newly born population exceeded 30,000. Considering the Han tribe's total population was only a little over 100,000, this was no small number. Of course, this 30,000 referred to those currently alive and kicking. Those who had died in infancy were not included. The infant mortality rate for Han tribe children under 6, according to the data, was 37%. Shocking. However, it was within your expectations. Truthfully, if it hadn't exceeded 50%, you would have been burning incense in gratitude. This was the result after you had painstakingly improved the people's quality of life. Before the Han tribe's establishment, the infant mortality rates in those smaller tribes would have been terrifyingly high. You recalled reading that in ancient times, the mortality rate for those under 15 was around 30%. Still, horrifying, but at least not quite 1/3. When the People's Republic was newly founded, statistics also showed a newborn mortality rate as high as 200 per thousand, meaning 1 in 5 children didn't survive to adulthood. At that time, the infant mortality rate in America was 60 per thousand, significantly lower. The Han tribe was still in a primitive era. Although some aspects had developed impressively, its foundation was undeniably weak. The revolution was not yet complete. Comrades still needed to strive harder. Looking at the statistics for causes of death, the problems became crystal clear. The data showed that over 10% of Han tribe newborns died directly during childbirth. In other words, these poor little souls never even got a glimpse of this vibrant world before logging off. And that wasn't the worst of it. Even more tragically, when such a situation occurred, the mother's chances of survival were also slim to none. Difficult labor and postpartum hemorrhage. These two were the main culprits leading to the loss of both mother and child. Of course, the most direct cause was the young age of the mothers. Becoming a mother at 13 or 14 when their bodies hadn't fully developed. How could problems not arise? This was a persistent, difficult issue. The only solution was to raise the age of childbearing. This matter had little to do with medicine. It was primarily a social policy problem. But abruptly raising the marriageable age to 18 would likely cause an uproar among the populace. Currently, the Han tribe's age of adulthood was 13, equivalent to a middle schooler in modern times, indeed too young. But if you directly jump to 18, the voices of opposition would probably drown you. You yourself were conflicted. This would significantly slow the Han tribe's population growth, but you couldn't turn a blind eye to the problem. So you decided to use the boiling a frog in lukewarm water approach, gradually raising the age of adulthood year by year, 1 year older each year, 13 this year, 14 next year, 15 the year after, finally settling the age of adulthood at 16. A slow transition over 3 or 4 years would allow everyone to gradually adapt without causing too much of a shock to population growth. Marrying at 16 wasn't too outrageous even in modern society. For instance, in Russia and South Korea, the legal marriageable age was 16. Raising the age standard was just the first step. The maternal and child health care system also needed improvement. For example, training professional midwives, or simply establishing maternity and child care hospitals, designated by region, where all births would take place. In the long run, you leaned towards the latter. Specialized hospitals were more reliable. These measures primarily targeted the 10% who died during childbirth. Nearly another 27% of infants and young children died from various strange causes. Fever, cause unknown. Vomiting and diarrhea, cause also unknown. Intractable diseases, basically untreatable. Poisoning, trauma, and various accidental deaths, such as drowning in rivers or being snatched by wild animals while wandering off. Excluding accidental deaths, the rest mostly fell within the scope of preventable or treatable medical conditions. This was where there was potential, especially fevers, vomiting, diarrhea, poisoning, and trauma. These were common ailments that absolutely required thorough research. Fever was just fever. Scientifically speaking, a fever is actually the human immune system's self-disinfection process. A low-grade fever below 38 degrees Celsius? A mere trifle. Modern doctors wouldn't even bother prescribing medicine and would tell you that a little fever is good for you. However, if the body temperature soared too high, it became problematic, potentially damaging human organs and tissues. Mild cases could result in disabilities like blindness or deafness from the fever. Severe cases could lead directly to death, a visit to King Yama for tea. The Han tribe lacked doctors and medicine, but it wasn't entirely helpless. For instance, guasha, skin scraping, which you had previously used on Qbing, was a good method for reducing fever. Additionally, drinking hot water, covering up with blankets to induce sweating, or using physical cooling methods like rubbing the body with alcohol. The Han tribe could already brew white liquor. Producing high-concentration alcohol was simply a matter of a few more distillations. Besides, medical alcohol was only 75% pure. Purer wasn't always better, as, for specific antipyretic medicinal herbs, those could only be found slowly. Rushing wouldn't help. The remaining issues, vomiting, diarrhea, and poisoning, could actually be bundled together, as poisoning sometimes also caused vomiting and diarrhea. Firstly, vigorous public education was needed to encourage everyone to proactively avoid toxic things, like poisonous insects and plants. Minor food poisoning also needed attention. Don't carelessly eat unfamiliar wild vegetables or fruits, and don't drink raw well water directly. It must be boiled before consumption. Spoiled or rotten food must absolutely not be eaten. Of course, intentionally fermented foods didn't count. For other foods, even leftovers from the previous day, they had to be thoroughly reheated before eating. Some people had sensitive stomachs and could get diarrhea from eating cold leftovers. These were all avoidable. Besides education, emetic methods could be used for treatment. Gastric lavage was a bit difficult for now, but it could be researched gradually. Then there was the active search for drugs to treat vomiting and diarrhea. This also required time. Finally, there were intestinal parasites. This was easy. Realgar wine to the rescue. Modern people had eaten pagoda-shaped deworming candy. Ancient people had their own ingenious deworming methods, namely Realgar wine. Realgar powder could expel insects, and drinking it in wine could expel internal parasites. This was one of the few traditional Chinese medicine folk remedies you knew. However, Realgar wine didn't taste great and shouldn't be drunk excessively. Once or twice a year for symbolic purposes was enough. The ancients were quite clever about this, linking the drinking of Realgar wine to festival customs, making it more acceptable and affordable for everyone. You planned to directly copy this, establishing the Dragon Boat Festival as a statutory holiday for the Han tribe. Making zongzi, glutinous rice dumplings, drinking Realgar wine, burning moxa, bathing in moxa-infused water, spring cleaning, and driving away poisonous insects. All these customs could be promoted. As for dragon boat racing, forget it. This world had no Yuan to commemorate, and, besides, not all Han tribe prefectures were near water. They lacked the conditions. Moreover, it was too expensive and time-consuming. Other customs like ancestor worship and tomb sweeping could be incorporated. The date of the Dragon Boat Festival would also be directly copied. The 5th day of the 5th lunar month, easy to remember. Moreover, this time coincided with high summer, the season when poisonous insects were most active. A nationwide spring cleaning and pest extermination campaign was quite necessary. As you pondered, you jotted down your thoughts on paper, item by item, fearing you might forget them later. These were all treatment and prevention plans for symptoms like fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and poisoning. The last item remaining was trauma. This was actually relatively easy to treat, as the Han tribe already had existing trauma medicine, and you yourself were quite adept at treating external injuries. having learned battlefield first aid in your previous life, which mostly involved dealing with knife and arrow wounds. External injuries, depending on severity, were also classified as minor and major. Further subdivision could even single out orthopedics as a systematic medical discipline. For external injuries, the main aspects requiring attention were disinfection, hemostasis, wound dressing and treatment, anti-inflammation, and post-operative care. Disinfection was manageable. The Han tribe now had alcohol. As for hydrogen peroxide, that could be produced using dilute sulfuric acid, but it was energy-intensive and had a pathetically short shelf life, unsuitable for mass production. Iodine or iodophore, the Han tribe's current chemical capabilities, weren't up to that yet. For now, alcohol was the most suitable disinfectant with a sufficiently long shelf life. Apart from being quite irritating to wounds, causing yelps of pain, it had no other major drawbacks. For hemostasis and wound dressing, treatment methods like suturing and ligation could be introduced. These were common medical techniques in ancient China. In terms of the variety and purpose of surgical instruments, if traditional Chinese surgery claimed to be second, no one in the world would dare claim first. Traditional Chinese medicine did have surgery, and it appeared very early, long before Hua Tuo, the famed physician who scraped bone to remove poison. Hua Tuo merely gained renown for inventing mafesin, an anesthetic powder. It was just a pity you weren't formally trained in Chinese medicine and didn't have a deep enough understanding of these things. However, you did know some basics. For instance, medical sutures weren't actually made from intestines but from silk. Silk, produced by silkworms, is mainly protein and can be absorbed by the human body. Used for internal suturing and ligation, it spared patients the ordeal of suture removal. This was the standard medical supply. In emergency situations, if no thread was available, the patient's own hair could be used for temporary suturing, but it had to be disinfected first. In the Han tribe, both men and women typically had long flowing hair. Now, there would be no shortage of suturing material in emergencies. Then there was major trauma surgery, which usually involved internal organs, including orthopedics. Orthopedics also had external bone-setting techniques, but there were also open fractures, severe injuries where the broken bone protruded directly from a deep wound. There was no easy solution for this. It could only be explored and researched slowly. However, the Han tribe had ample conditions in this regard. Those cannibalistic prisoners of war and slaves could serve as test subjects for students to practice on. The Han tribe had plenty of silent teachers, medical cadavers mostly donated with a few unclaimed bodies, respectfully called silent teachers by students. Intact bodies were called whole-body teachers. They were man-eating outsiders anyway. There was no need for humanitarian considerations with them. Of course, experimental animals were also indispensable. In this aspect, one could learn from the experiences of your previous life, using animals like rats, rabbits, dogs, monkeys, and apes for drug testing or surgical practice. Only after achieving certain results in animal experiments would human clinical trials be conducted. By dissecting more corpses, obtaining more human skeletal specimens, and thoroughly familiarizing everyone with the 200-odd bones in the human body, as well as various tissues and organs, you were confident you could train qualified doctors. Moreover, the most important aspect of a medical college wasn't the medical techniques themselves, but their transmission. This, in fact, was even more crucial than medicine itself. Of the cultural treasures passed down through thousands of years of traditional Chinese medicine, not much had actually survived. Many valuable things were lost during transmission. Why? Because of that odious ancient custom of passing down to sons but not daughters, to insiders but not outsiders. Not just Chinese medicine, but many advanced technologies and cultural treasures were lost due to this feudal dross, people preferring to take them to their graves rather than pass them on to outsiders. You were deeply aware of the harm caused by such outdated customs and would certainly not repeat the same mistake. Since you were going to develop medicine, you would consolidate all talent and resources for unified training, using modern teaching models to mass-produce doctors. That was the best way to improve the overall medical standards of the populace. All medical knowledge would be compiled into books, and human anatomy would be illustrated in atlases. These would then be printed in bulk and used as textbooks for medical students, ensuring that all knowledge could be passed down without omission. That was the most important thing, far more important than mere medical techniques. As for the textbooks needed for the medical college, you even had the names figured out. First, Compendium of Materia Medica, a popular science book specifically introducing the characteristics of various medicinal herbs. The content would include morphological descriptions, growth environments, collection methods, cultivation techniques, processing methods, usage and dosage, primary functions, contraindications, and so on. The more detailed, the better. You certainly wouldn't write such a book yourself. Otherwise, why would you trade titles for others' medicinal herbs? Those herbs previously provided by the common folk and officially verified could now be included. As for other therapeutic effects, contraindications, usage, and dosage, those could be gradually pondered and continuously improved, providing a clear direction, enabling Han tribe medical education to avoid some detours. This was already the greatest contribution you could make. Second, Atlas of Internal and External Human Anatomy. From skin to muscle, from organs to bones, everything would be dissected and meticulously illustrated. Since they were going to treat human illnesses, they naturally had to first understand the human body, this complex and precise machine. Not only would there be anatomical drawings of various parts, but the functions of each organ, common pathological changes, causes of these changes, treatment recommendations, and so on, all needed to be detailed and explained. Others could include: third, Record of Miraculous Han Medical Prescriptions. This would specifically collect classic prescriptions that had been proven effective. This could also be pursued, drawing on collective wisdom. Fourth, Secret Compendium of Health Preservation. This would include some fitness exercises, similar to the ancient 5 animal frolics. Also, some dietary therapy recipes for health preservation, as well as rehabilitation methods for severe injuries or illnesses. Fifth, Collected treatments for miscellaneous diseases. This would specifically record treatment methods for various difficult and miscellaneous diseases, including their causes, symptoms, and treatment plans. Although such a book might seem niche, it could at least provide some reference for future generations. When later generations encountered similar intractable diseases, they would have a treatment approach to draw upon. Sixth, Infectious diseases and hygiene. As the name suggests, this would primarily focus on the prevention and control of various infectious diseases, which was also very important. Seventh, Common knowledge for maternal and child health. This could be printed in large quantities and promoted among the populace. It would mainly compile precautions for women during pregnancy and for infants and young children, aiming to improve maternal and child health levels. These 7 books couldn't be produced by a single person in a short amount of time. The compilation process for these 7 books was, in fact, the development direction you had set for the medical college. Only by successfully writing these 7 books could the Han tribe's medical standards be truly consolidated, possessing its own theoretical foundation and system of inheritance. It encompassed almost all fundamental medical theoretical knowledge. Of course, these were just the basics. In any case, the first step was to use this method to train a batch of qualified doctors. As for future development, you would warmly welcome brilliant individuals to write new medical masterpieces, such as medical canons like Prescriptions Worth 1,000 Gold for Gynecology or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon. After all, medicine not only requires exploration and research, but also, more importantly, accumulation and inheritance. It is a continuously evolving process. You had already pointed them in the right direction. The rest would depend on their own efforts. Although, You knew many things. You were ultimately not an omnipotent god. Some things still required everyone to work together.